Greetings, gamers. Tim here again. And today I wanted to talk about science fiction games and why they have trouble reaching as many fans as fantasy games. Part of it is, yeah, a fantasy game was the first on the block. It's the big uh, dragon on the hill for all the rest of them that has only briefly been nudged off the hill in the 90s with the White Wolf games. But we all know that game. But part of it boils down to what I call the intrusion of the familiar or the familiar intrusion, whatever you want to, however you want to phrase it. But it's that if you are, somebody explains a fantasy thing to you, and they say elves or they say dwarves, you have images of these things. Now these may not be exactly what's in the book, they may be very different, but because of fairy tales, because of folk tales, because of cartoons, because of just fairly basic fantasy stuff has intruded into the public knowledge enough so that a lot of people are familiar with those terms and are familiar with what's kind of expected. Now, lots of people try and play away from that expectation, but it usually doesn't go very far because if you go too far, those words no longer apply and people get confused. But we don't have that with science fiction games. Though we have had science fiction games since fairly early in role-playing games, in tabletop role-playing particularly, and that is because we had Traveller, which is the big uh, spaceship of all sci-fi games. It's been around forever. It's had multiple editions. It's had slightly different iterations over the years. But even then, it has aliens that if I were to tell you the names of, you wouldn't necessarily know them if you saw a picture. Now, some you might. For example, the Aslan. The Aslan are in Traveller. They're a species that vaguely resembles humanoid lions. And of course, a lot of people are familiar with the term Aslan from the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is a fantasy thing. And you kind of recognize that. The actual term comes from Turkish. It just means lion. And that's why they were named that, because humans named them. There are other species in the game, though, that get more and more separated from what we know, from anything we can hang on information on. The same goes with Mass Effect. If I was going to tell you there's an Elcor in this book, you probably don't know what I'm talking about, or Hanar, or an Asari, unless you're a Mass Effect player. But those things don't appear in other sci-fi. And because they don't appear in a lot of sci-fi, they don't have that intrusion of the familiar into many people's lives. Now, science fiction fans will probably know them, especially those who like video games. And the fact that we don't have a tabletop Mass Effect role-playing game is really, really just how screwed up our universe is at times. Because to me, it was a much better game than all the Dragon Age games. But Dragon Age got a tabletop role-playing game. But Mass Effect, they didn't even offer it, apparently. And that bugs me because it really is probably the closest we've got to having that intrusion of familiar to most people outside the framework of Star Wars and Star Trek. And even then, if I'm talking about a Star Wars alien and I tell somebody something other than the ones that we saw as main characters on screen, such as a Wookiee or an Ewok, they're not going to have that unless they're just diehard Star Wars fans. If I tell you that's a Shistavan, you're probably not going to know what that is. Well, there's a new Star Wars television show that had a Shistavan as one of the bad guys. They're these wolf humanoids. And, but you don't necessarily know the name. You're like, oh yeah, I get that idea. And Star Wars did a great thing by showing you this cantina scene where they showed you all these different wildly strange looking aliens. They don't always work on screen well outside of a very dark and very controlled set of uh, fiction, but at least if you see something, you're like, that's familiar, if you saw Star Wars. The same goes with Star Trek to a limited extent, a little less than Star Wars because they've had a little less intrusion than Star Wars. I'm not saying Star Trek is better. I'm not saying Star Wars is worse. I've enjoyed both over the years, although neither one of them are my favorites, which probably will weird most of you out. I used to really love Star Wars. I used to. And I enjoyed a great deal Star Trek. But I was really too young when I was watching Star Trek, the original generation, to understand the nuances of the show. And I hadn't gone back in a long time to watch those, but I did catch on to later shows and watch them and enjoy them. And now, as an older person, I recognize those nuances. So the nuances that might have made these things more important to me as a fan were missed because I was just too young when it came on. Star Wars, not so much. I was taken to Star Wars when it first aired as a little kid. And man, I was sold. It worked so well for me. I was so excited by it. And I was completely happy with the universe with just 3 movies. I know, like, over the years there's been a whole bunch of stuff, including a role-playing game for both Star Wars and Star Trek, which helped a little bit. And the amusing thing is, Weston Games, who created the original Star Wars D6 role-playing game, they filled in a lot of details that Star Wars still uses to this day, because a lot of it was just, look, a picture on the screen. No explanation, no details of what that is, just an image, or just a spaceship flying by. And it's those creators who filled in the details. But if I use those details because you're not necessarily a tabletop role player who adores Star Wars, you may not know the races. I gotta fly, stupid buck. Anyway, the thing is that we really just don't have the firm intrusion of sci-fi things. I have seen games that try to use a little bit of like UFO lore, unidentified flying object lore, so that they have used greys and reptoids or whatever from what people believe have visited us. But for me, as a science fiction fan, as a science fan, I see those as about as believable as elves in the real world. It's like, yeah, it's folktale, it's fairy tale. It's something constructed by a group of people, mostly in their heads, from things they claimed happened. Did that not happen to them? I don't know. I don't know them. All I know is that from the intrusion of those things, that, like, I will recognize if a gray is on screen. I will recognize if a lizard person's on screen, what they're probably referencing. Just like back in the days when the V television series came on, and they had the lizard people in masks, rubber masks that were really supposed to be humans, and they really couldn't have fit those masks on those lizard faces that well. But whatever. But I get where they were drawing from, which was that UFO lore. And in many ways, that is less believable to me than any created specifically for a game or book science fiction race. Because it's literally, I guess you would call it urban mythology or modern mythology. It just doesn't have a consensus that's clear. And unlike fantasy, where we've got distance from it, we don't examine it in the same way we would those things. And they haven't intruded upon fiction nearly as much as elves and dwarves and other fantasy things have. And fundamentally, that is why I don't think there's any true killer Star Wars, science fiction game. We just don't have one. We don't have one that reaches out and grabs you and says, you must play me. And I'm not saying that has to do with systems necessarily. Traveler has a fairly elegant, fairly streamlined system, at least in some iterations. Um, and I think it's a neat science fiction game. It's got some neat aliens, but it's not the main ones that most people would recognize that I find interesting. Like the Hyber. I like the Hyber. The Hyber are interesting, but they're not one of the main species that are presented in this game. There are other ones. I mean, there's lots. I know that Starfinder, which is a combination of fantasy and science fiction, has its own races, like the Lashunta, and what are the other ones? The Shirin. And then there's Mass Effect, which of course it varies things like the Asari and the Elcor and all that. And they're visually very interesting, you know. I mean, and that's cool. I was more impacted by Babylon 5's aliens in terms like, yeah, most of them are rubber forehead aliens, but you kind of have to do that to have the actors play them until CGI caught up with the ability to portray the more and more alien things. I remember reading about how expensive it was to operate the Babylon 5 Mantis thing puppet, the one that wasn't CGI, that was the broker of information that hid in the space station. But and that's the thing. I have been literally searching for a sci-fi game that literally says this game is the game you need to play. I have played Traveler a few times, but I'm not run it. But even that, even though I think it's a great game, it doesn't screenplay me. Um, Star Wars, Star Trek, the same way. They don't screenplay me. Although I did play a lot of Star Wars D6 back in the day and enjoyed it, I wasn't one who ran it. I was always just a player of that. And while I've used the Star Wars universe more recently, it was just one of those things that never really said, you need to do this. You can tell great stories with this. And it wasn't anything against Star Wars, or it's not anything against Star Trek, or any other pre-created sci-fi out there, except we still just don't have this one big draw people together sci-fi product. I have picked up quite a few over the years. I've got some on my shelves, some in PDF, and I'm always looking for more to try and find something that truly speaks to me with interesting aliens. One of the best that I enjoyed was Star Frontier, which has Rust, which are these bug people. They're kind of centaur bug people. They look very ant slash mantis like, but they're not either one. Dralacites were kind of a amorphous blob of people. Isarians, which are kind of a glider membrane mixed with ape. And Sathar, which are annelid, a worm alien. They had a lot of others that show up in adventures, but those were the core races. And they were the ones, since they were the first ones I encountered in role-playing, that stuck with me. And that may be true of other people. But not enough that I'm like, oh yeah, I need to put that in this game. Even if it's a completely different sci-fi setting that I want to run. Alternity came out in the late 90s, and it had some interesting races. The Sashayan, the Frawl, the Mechalus, the Waren, and the Tassa. Of course, the ones I liked the most were the weirdest ones, the Sashayan. But that's the thing. There is no alien species that says, write about this in every thing. Write about this in every game. Use this in every game because you like it. And fantasy has elves and dwarves and other things that are so ingrained that they work. Although I'm not a big happy camper with as many of those in everything that people sometimes want. I don't need 310 races or species, depending on how you want to term them, in a game. And there is a difference, by the way. It's weird. And like, yeah, I've written things with elves and dwarves in them, and I probably will again. I have my own ideas of alien species, but will I be able to tell people that these are and make them interesting enough that people will use them then more for just playing my specific game? Will they drag it over to another system? Will they drag it over to another setting? And there are some people who do that no matter what. And there are some people who are like, yeah, no, I'm just going to play this new setting completely. I have heard that we're getting a game based upon the video game that's not even out yet, Exodus, created by some of the same people who worked on early Mass Effect. But so far, nothing I've seen has made me go, yeah, I want that game. Unlike Mass Effect, which to me would have been the perfect, because it's got the most intrusion outside of the two Star fandoms that I'm aware of. And of course, there's Doctor Who, but Doctor Who isn't a space exploration sci-fi game. It's a time and space exploration game, and it doesn't really lean on the science or believability of things so much, which is a problem for me. So that's where I'm at, and I'm wondering, do you have your, I guess you would call it a killer app or preferred setting or whatever for a sci-fi game, and your favorite aliens that you just love to have in as much as you can make them exist in? I don't know. You might not. And I will tell you, like, I've got a huge number of sci-fi games over here. I've got a couple here by my side on this little table that I use. So, yeah, my dog broke my keyboard tray, and I got a replacement keyboard tray, but it doesn't have room for the mouse. So I had to set up a little TV dinner tray to basically utilize my mouth comfortably. Anyway, but that's where I'm at. I've babbled a lot. Share your favorite sci-fi with me. Your favorite aliens, your favorite settings, your favorite game systems, whatever. And I swear though, if you bring up Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder and say, well, but you can use this for sci-fi, I will block you. Well, maybe not. I'm not that mean. Look, no. You can stretch some systems very, very far, but those two systems are not the ideal ones. There's a reason why Starfinder First Edition differed so much from Pathfinder First Edition, because it has different expectations. On the other hand, and I'm going to say this, I looked at Espergenesis, which is a science fiction setting where they completely rewrote the Dungeons and Dragons rules for sci-fi stuff. And it looks neat. It still looks like it's going to feel like D&D, which is not what I want from a sci-fi game at all. But, at least they tried. They tried to take that and stretch it as far as possible. And I think they're probably going to be one of the best ones. Now, and there aren't games out there that have a wide bit of intrusion, not necessarily with familiarity, but to gamers, because they have a lot of useful tools like Stars Without Number. And generally speaking, that's good. I like it. But they still, like the core book, because I have the free edition, doesn't have any aliens. And to me, that sells me on a space exploration game. It's one of the reasons I don't own The Expanse, which I think is probably an incredible setting. But since it doesn't deal with alien species, I have a lot less interest in it. Because I am very much leaning into there is more than you can imagine in the universe. Because statistically speaking, if life happened on Earth once, with the sheer number of planets that we have discovered, and are probably going to discover in the future, if all the chemistry that worked to make us work repeats itself anywhere, or even only partly so, there's probably going to be life there. It may not be sentient, it may not be something we can talk to, it may not be something we understand. But frankly, we are discovering so many stars and so many planets, and just the sheer statistical potential of that makes me hope. Probably won't ever be in my lifetime that we figure anything out about it because the vastness of space is huge. Anyway, that's all for me. That's where I stand. God bless good gaming. See you next time.